He graduated with a Ph.D. in economics from FSU back in 1994. And thank you for helping me out as I go. I can't believe you're. He's author or co-author of 150 or more books, including probably what many of you encountered as your principal economics textbook. And he's here today to talk a little bit about economic freedom and entrepreneurship and how that affects prosperity. And some of that may relate to our experience here in South Carolina. So without any other introduction, I'm going to give you Dr. Russ Sobel.
Well, thank you. Such a pleasure to be here tonight. I grew up here in Charleston, and actually my father was the sports broadcaster for Charleston Southern back when I was a little boy, so I used to come out to the games when he was on the radio and used to do the play-by-play for the basketball and football. I know for sure, maybe also baseball. I'm not sure. But anyway, I grew up here. I moved away. I was up at West Virginia University for 20 years, and was lucky enough 3 years ago to move back here to Charleston, my hometown. I'm just really enjoying being back here in my hometown. And so I'm teaching at the Citadel right now. I was at the College of Charleston for a while. I'm still searching for a permanent home so that I can stay here in Charleston for the rest of my life. So anyway, thanks for having me out tonight. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here with you this evening. And I understand some of you have been maybe looking at the book Unleashing Capitalism that I put together with a team of other Ph.D. economists about policy reform here in South Carolina. That's now been spun out for 4 or 5 different states who have versions of that book. And my talk tonight is kind of based on that book, but it's a lot more general, and so I'm going to pull in some material from it. And although, let me please say during the Q&A period, if you've been reading that, feel free to ask questions that pertain to specific things in that may or may not be in the presentation here tonight. Let me start out with what's my very favorite picture. This is a satellite photo of the Earth at night. And you know, when we look around the globe, what you can see is that there's some places that are bright and shining with prosperity and wealth. And then sadly, there's some other places on the face of the globe that are dark, dim, and impoverished. And what the field of economics has been about since its inception is to try to figure out the why. Why is it that some places are lucky enough to grow rich and other places remain poor? Well, what explains these differences? And we're a science in economics. We collect data and we put it to the test to see if our theories are holding versus the real world. And we've considered a lot of alternative explanations for these differences. For example, one of the ones that we looked into is resources. Maybe it's just the case that the countries who have natural resources under their soil, they're lucky enough to dig in the ground, there's crude oil or there's gold or whatever, that they become rich, and then it's the places that don't have resources to work with that are poor. But it turns out nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, when you look at the data, there's actually a negative correlation between resource abundance and prosperity. And even anecdotally, we can see how obvious this is not true. If you look at Argentina and Venezuela, for example, they're resource abundant, they're very resource rich, and they're poor. While we've got places like Hong Kong and Japan that are volcanic islands out in the middle of the ocean. Hong Kong has no natural resources to speak of. It doesn't even have enough drinking water for its own population. It has to import its drinking water. But yet Japan and Hong Kong are some of the wealthiest places on the face of the globe. And even if we look around the United States, 50 states, we see places like West Virginia, which is resource abundant and also a very poor state. So it's really not the resources that these countries have that explains these differences. Now, ironically enough, we've actually known the answer to this question all along. The father of economics, Adam Smith, wrote a book in 1776 called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. And I should point out, I've got an Adam Smith tie on tonight. All the economists have a couple of Adam Smith ties when we go to presentations. So. Anyway, so in 1776, the father of economics, Adam Smith, wrote our very first book in economics. And what he set out to answer in that book was the question we're answering. Why is it that there's places that are rich and other places that aren't? What is the nature and causes of that? And in 1776, Adam Smith in that book concluded that really it's more about the policies and system of economic organization of the country that determine its prosperity. And that is whether you rely on capitalism and free markets, and whether you allow private ownership of property and decentralized entrepreneurship. Countries that do that tend to become rich. And that the countries that are mired in socialism, with central planning, don't allow private ownership, mostly government command and control types of economies, are the ones that remain poor. Now, it's not that other things don't matter at all. It's just that nothing matters as much as your economic system. You can have no resources to work with, and as long as you've got good policies, you'll still be rich. Now, in economics, we actually have rankings of different countries' reliance on capitalism. You'll see some of these posters around campuses. You look around. Pearson's got a nice one in his office, and Russ has his office as well. I use the annual report cover from a few years ago because it's got a really nice photo on the front that matches well. But there's more recent versions. This is an annual index that comes out that ranks all the countries in the world for which they can get data on their reliance on capitalism. The project's actually pretty interesting in terms of how it got started. They had this conference and they brought together a bunch of the living Nobel Prize-winning economists, and they sat down and they asked, okay, can we come up with a consensus among economists as to what kind of policies we agree are good for prosperity and which ones aren't? And they came up with a list, and then they go around for each country basically and say, hey, which policies do you have? You have this one, this one, this one. And the countries that score well are the ones who have systems of economic freedom, or capitalism, are the ones in blue. And the ones that score very poorly don't rely on capitalism, rely on central planning and socialism, are the ones that are red. And you can even see the striking resemblance between this little picture of their scores and the Earth at night photo. It's the places that are red that remain dark, dim, and impoverished, and it's the places that are in blue that are bright, shining, and prosperous. Now, I tell everybody if I could teach everybody one thing about economic development and how an economy works in a nutshell, this would be it. So here's how an economist views how all economies work. Every economy starts off with some inputs and resources to work with, their labor force, technology, whatever they have, and they try to turn them into these outcomes that they want. Job creation, new goods and services, wealth and prosperity, and wage growth. But what's here in the middle is what I'm here to talk about tonight. What economists call the rules of the game, or the government policies that work in a location. And it turns out the rules of the game really matter in terms of influencing people's behavior. When I have to teach this idea to, say, fourth graders, it's pretty easy to understand how this broadly applies to lots of things. So when I go to a fourth grade class, I'll ask them stuff like, is it true that you have a friend's house you go over to, or maybe a relative's house you go over to, where you behave differently than you do in your own house? And boy, I'll get hands going up everywhere, and they'll start telling me stories about, yeah, when we go over to Johnny's house, we always pick up the toys there. I don't really do that at my house, but that's because his mom, won't give us cookies until we, clean up the room. The point is that the rules of the game, the incentive structure that's present, influences your behavior, whether we're talking about rules in a household or rules that the government sets as to how to operate a business, bankruptcy laws, tax policy laws. That the rules of the game really, really matter, and there's actually some really cool experiments in economics where they take real games, things like the Monopoly board game, and start messing with the rules to see how people respond differently to different rules of the game. But that's exactly the framework that I want you to think about here, is that really in terms of like a game of Monopoly, individuals are the players. We have this little rule book that sets all the rules of the game, and that influences the outcomes of things. Now, really in the process of economic development, the best analogy for this, though, is baking yummy, delicious cakes and cookies. Now, you start out with your ingredients. These are the ingredients. You put them in the oven. This is the oven. And out the oven come delicious, yummy cakes and cookies. And here's fundamentally the problem. If the oven is broken, you can keep shoveling ingredients into it all day long and nothing comes out the other side. If the oven isn't working, I don't care what wonderful ingredients you have. And too many governments around the world, both federal governments and state governments, try to promote these economic outcomes that we want. Get out of the recession. What do we do today? Oh, just spend more money. Just shovel more ingredients into the oven. I mean, West Virginia is a classic example of them, and I'll use a couple examples from West Virginia here, because I was up there for 20 years and know quite a lot about some of the problems in that state. But what we've been trying to do now for at least 50 or 60 years is to get West Virginia out of being at the bottom of the rankings by dumping federal money in there. That state received per capita more federal money over the last 50 or 60 years than any other state in America. In fact, as much per capita as multiple states combined. We've just been pouring resources into that state, trying to funnel money in there to get them to be more prosperous, and it's not working. And our federal level, we've been trying to shovel-ready projects and all this stimulus to get the economy going. But the problem is that if the problem is here, that doesn't work. And so let me give you a very specific example of what I'm talking about. 30 years ago up in West Virginia, they undertook the most expensive road construction project in the nation at the time. They took a 2-lane winding road that went across the state and made it into a 4-lane divided highway. And if you read the congressional debates about funding this road, it was really expensive at the time for West Virginia. The debates go something like this. The people from West Virginia, the Congress stand up, the representatives, and say, well, look, How can you guys be against this? We're going to create a path of prosperity across the poorest state in the nation. I mean, this is a state that all it really needs is some infrastructure, and if we can just create this infrastructure, it's going to balloon and grow and become very, very prosperous. So anyway, the Congress voted to allocate the funds, and sure enough, they went and built Route 50. And here's pictures I took driving down it with my cell phone out my car window. So of course, there's signs up from the politicians to let you know who brought you the highway system so they can get your vote next election. But here's what the road looks like. It's been there for 30 years. This is the foot of my car. You can drive down the road for about 2 hours and basically not see another car. There's a good hour and a half stretch of the road where there's not even a gas station. Where's the path to prosperity? This was supposed to be done to create economic development. I mean, you didn't even see other cars on the road. We're talking this is in the middle of nothing. Where's the path to prosperity? I mean, the road's been there for 30 years. Well, here's the problem. The problem is there was no trucks on that road 30 years ago. There's no trucks on that road today. How do you solve the problem? I kid you not, when they got the stimulus money in West Virginia, somebody stood up in the legislature and claimed the road just wasn't big enough and they needed to make it 3 lanes in this direction. And this is the philosophy I'm talking about. Well, if you want it, just spend more money. Well, that's not the solution, and that's not going to work. See, here's the problem that really goes back to my little graphic a minute ago, is that if West Virginia, it has the worst business climate in the country. It's horrible to do business there. If they would get that fixed, then businesses would start locating there. Once businesses start locating there, trucks are on the roadways, and then the roadways get congested. Then guess what you do? Then you expand the roadways so that people can utilize those to transport goods and services. But you can't just build the roads and then expect them to work when the problem wasn't that they were resource poor to begin with. The problem is they've got bad policies, and no amount of spending and dumping money at the problem can fix something like that. Now, the best example of it globally, though, is the case of North and South Korea. And there they are, here's a blow-up of the lights at night difference to show you the difference between North and South Korea. And it's not just the lights at night that will tell you something's different. The average resident in South Korea is about as rich as the average American, while the average resident in North Korea is about as rich as the average person in Africa. And the reason that this is such a good example in economics is it really is a controlled experiment. North and South Korea basically have the same ingredients to bake cookies with at the start of the day. They have the same access to ports and harbors, the same geography, the same climate. But more importantly, going back through time, this was one country for most of its life. But for most of history, this was just Korea. Meaning that the DNA, there's not even cultural differences here. There was a war that created an artificial line between the north and south parts of the country. I mean, the DNA of the people living here and here is the same. I mean, they've got a common culture, common history. All of that difference is due to the difference in economic systems. South Korea ranks in the top 25 most free market capitalist countries on the face of the globe, while North Korea ranks dead last, down to Venezuela, in terms of its economic freedom ranking. This is the difference policies make. You can determine whether your country is rich or whether your country is poor. Now, let me actually put some perspective on this by giving you a quick tour of the world. But as I do this, there's two things I want to pull from it. One, I want you to see how much economic freedom matters for standards of living. But more importantly, I want to try to challenge a belief that you may have heard. A lot of people say, oh, the reason Africa is poor, or the reason West Virginia is poor, is because they just don't have any entrepreneurs there. They just don't have creative people. There's nobody in those places who thinks and can come up with new ideas and thinks out of the box. And we just don't have entrepreneurial people there. So as we're going through these, I want to ask you, is it the people or the policies that are the problem? Let's use a bigger picture of the Economic Freedom Report. And why don't we go to a couple countries and visit them? Let's start with some countries with very low economic freedom. Let's start with Zimbabwe here in Africa. And we'll see what life is like in Zimbabwe. They're not allowed to own property there. There's no formal property rights. So basically these tribes have to move to different pieces of government land until they get chased off. So this little village will probably come through and be demolished pretty quickly, and they'll have to move everything somewhere else until they can squat there for a while until somebody else chases them off that piece. And this is a picture that I want to spend some time on. We tend to look at a picture like this and feel very sad and sorry for people there because they need a lot of help, and they do. But let me get you to think about this picture in a different way. People claim that the reason countries like this are poor is the people there can't be entrepreneurial, things outside the box. Let me just ask you one question. If tonight you woke up and found yourself in the desert of Zimbabwe with no money, no tools, could you with your bare hands build a house for you and your family to sleep in tonight by the time you go to bed? This guy can. In fact, I'm sometimes. Just like, I mean, think about how unbelievable it is. It's very hard to get the sand to stick together, just to get the roofs on this. I mean, in just a few hours of time, this guy can take and locate to a piece of land he's never been to before with no resources and build somewhere to live. I mean, I would be out there starving to death and being rained on. You know, it'd be like he'd be stealing my girlfriend because he can provide for her, you know, feed her and house her, and I'm like, I don't know what to do. I'm trying to get the stand to stick together, and it won't, you know? And it's like, here's the point. These people are hardworking, and they are creative, and they do think outside the box. They know how to use the resources around them to build the things that are important to them. The problem is these are temporary structures. They'll get bulldozed, and then somebody finds out they're there, and they don't actually have a plan. Now let's move up the ladder, but only a little bit, to another country with low economic freedom. It does better than Zimbabwe, but not a whole lot. Romania. Romania used to be part of the Soviet bloc country, still fairly mired in socialist policies. My friend went to Romania a couple of years ago, and he took these pictures of David. This is what life is like in Romania. Now, he actually interviewed this woman. She runs a store in Romania. In Romania, you have to get permission from the government for every single product line you want to carry. So imagine running a convenience store. How many different goods are in a typical convenience store? And now you've got to count every different flavor of juicy fruit gum differently now. How many different items are in that store? Imagine having to lobby the government to get permission on each and every one. Well, that's the situation she's in. She's so far only been getting permission to sell one thing, but she's trying, and her customers want more, and she'd like to sell more to them, and she's worried that she's not going to be able to stay in business long if she can't get a couple more permits to sell more things to them. They also have a lot of restrictions on ownership of stuff, and the military takes most of the trucks, and these people have to make do with what they have. I really lied about the other one being my favorite picture, because I think this is my favorite presentation. You know, the funny thing about it is that I always used to say the 2 cows. After one of my talks came out and said, "You have a 3rd cow." Look, it's 2, it's 3, I don't care. 2's impressive enough. But here's what I want to do with this picture for a minute. It's asking, is it true that people in Romania can't think outside the box? I don't know how this guy gets 2 cows in the back of his car. I can't even get my dog in the back of my car. And this guy is getting 2 cows in the back of his car. How do you make do in a world without horse and tractor trailers that you can pull stuff around in? You do this. And all I know is had this guy lived in America, he would have probably invented the iPad, because he just thinks differently than the rest of us. And that's kind of my point, where we're going to discuss that later, is that really it's not the people here, it's the policies that are the problem. And imagine how much wealthier this gentleman could be if he could just run down the street to a dealership and buy a horse trailer. Transport more horses. He could maybe fit more than 2 in that, right? Increases productivity, increases wealth, increases earnings, trade with more people. You know, they're opening up to some of the big multinationals who have some political pull. The country has a long way to go. Now let's move up to the middle of the pack. So we looked at 2 countries who really don't rely on capitalism. They don't allow much decentralized entrepreneurship. Most don't allow a lot of private ownership of things. Now let's move up to countries who score about half. They get about half their policies right. So let's look at India. Here's India. India and Asia scores in the middle. They're in the green group of countries which are good. So here's life in India. It's starting to look a little bit better. I mean, you know, they're dressed a little bit nicer, permanent housing structures, people doing productive work. Another country that's virtually tied with India is the one right just south of our border, Mexico. And here's what life is like in Mexico. It looks virtually identical to life in India. There's a typical school that you would go to if you lived in Mexico. Yeah, it's paper plates and plastic chairs, but it's sure a lot better than Zimbabwe or Romania, right? So this is about the standard of living you get if you get about half your policies right. What happens if you do better than that? Well, let's look at some of the countries with high economic freedom. First, I want to take you to Hong Kong. I mentioned Hong Kong at the very outset of my presentation. Let me stop and fill you in a little bit more. Hong Kong is really a miracle. Let me tell you why. Had you visited Hong Kong in like the 1940s, 1950s, it would have been as poor as Africa is today. It was just a poor Asian country. And in a matter of 50 years, it's gone from being as poor as Africa to as rich as the United States of America. That country should teach us all a lesson in terms of how to go from being poor to being rich. Hong Kong scores #1 on the Economic Freedom of the World Index and has done so persistently for decades. According to our economists' list of policies, they have the best policies on the face of the planet. Give you some hands-on examples. I know there's a lot of things in there. This isn't a specific policy in there. But you as a foreigner could get off a plane in Hong Kong with a U.S. passport, U.S. citizen, walk into an office and with one slip of paper, with no fees, no review, sign a piece of paper, and get a business license to go over to business that afternoon. You can land in Hong Kong and be operating a business by the end of the day without paying a single penny or filling out one form. That's what life is like in Hong Kong. Things are easy to do. But they have the rule of law, and they enforce their rules very, very heavily. I mean, you're not allowed to steal, you're not allowed to violate other people's property rights, contract law. They have all the laws that keep people orderly and peaceful, and they have property rights. But in the economic sphere, they leave people pretty much free. They only get one tax in the whole economy. It's a flat tax, very easy to deal with for people. Anyway, this is what's happened to Hong Kong. Again, the pictures that I would, if I showed you Hong Kong in the 40s and 50s, it would look just like Zimbabwe. Here's Hong Kong today. Look at the schools there. They look equivalent to ours. Look at these cities. None of that was there 30 years ago. None of those buildings were there. Hong Kong's even more incredible because some of the people who used to try to argue about what causes prosperity versus not would claim that overpopulation and crowding are a problem. Really? More people per square mile in Hong Kong than anywhere else on the face of the planet. They're not poor. In fact, they've grown rich. Right? So it's not some sort of, wow, strain on the resources to have people. And you may, if you ever buy stuff on eBay, get your stuff shipped to you from Hong Kong. You want to know why? They have free trade. If you have a business in Hong Kong, you can import and export things without paying any special taxes. That's how they become prosperous. Free trade, the rule of law, reasonable regulations and taxes, limited government. Now, another country historically with high economic freedom, of course, has been the United States of America. For a long time, we ranked third, just after Hong Kong and Singapore in that index. Unfortunately, over the last 10 to 15 years, we've fallen. Every year, fallen some more. We've fallen in 4 to 5 main areas out of the index, so it's not one particular policy. But we're now down to about 19th, I think, in the most recent one, headed down. And it's pretty sad, and we're wondering if economic growth in the United States is going to suffer as a result of it. We can talk more about that during Q&A if you want, about what caused the decline. But historically, we've been in the top 3, and as a result, we've looked pretty much like Hong Kong and Australia and Western Europe. Look like this. And this is what happens when you genuinely get your policies right. Now, why is it that economic freedom matters so much? And this is really the nuts and bolts of what I want to talk about. It's really about entrepreneurship. An economic system of capitalism is one in which we allow entrepreneurs, individually, to make decisions about starting a business or not. Decentralized entrepreneurs. And entrepreneurs, as a result, keep inventing things that fundamentally make us better off and change the way we live. And I want to give you some examples. Here's how our homes have changed over basically the last 100 years. And not only are they bigger and prettier, but let's talk about some of the features. If you go back to, like, basically this is when well, for some of you have been when your parents were young, for others of you have been when your grandparents were young. The percent of homes in America that have heating and air conditioning is 6% of homes. 6 out of every 100. Of course, this was a study by the Federal Reserve Bank down in '96. Of course, it's gone up since then, but I drew some of this data from. But now, the vast majority of Americans have heating and air conditioning. And while you might just think, okay, it's a number, let's move on, that's not what we're going to do. We're going to talk about entrepreneurship. What really explains this is a story of a guy named Willis Carrier. Willis Carrier was an immigrant, a blue-collar worker in New York City. And Willis Carrier worked at this printing company, and the problem in New York City was during the summers, the ink wouldn't stick to the paper, and also having to waste ink, waste paper, was driving up some costs. Mr. Carrier decided to go home in the evenings and experiment at his house with building an air conditioner. And it worked. There's his first air conditioner, this gigantic machine. And he basically got it working, and he was able to use it at his boss's printing shop, and it worked great. He was able to keep the room a little bit cooler. And his boss said to him, Willis, you should try to sell this. You should try to run your own business and try to produce these things and sell them. And Willis is like, I don't know who else would want to buy these. And so anyway, he tries for a very long time and finally gets 2 places to buy his first air conditioner. There was a movie theater and a shopping mall, I believe in Detroit. And the argument that he tried to sell to was, look, if you put this thing in, you can advertise, we're the only place in town that has air conditioning. Come in and watch a movie or come in and shop because you can get out of the heat. Because no homes or anything had air conditioning at the time. And it worked. Those 2 places did it. Their sales boomed. Other places started calling and saying, we want an air conditioner for our mall, for our theater. And then, of course, as more and more of those start getting built, he gets better and better at this. He makes them smaller. He makes them cheaper. And then the industry gets big enough that people start competing with him. All the other companies come in and start opening air conditioning products. And so what happens 2 times, the air conditioners get cheaper, smaller, to the point where we can all afford to have one in our own home. Another thing that's very similar, percent of homes with only one bathroom. You know, my daughter, when she's grown up, had her own bathroom. You know, only 9% of homes in America only have one bathroom today. But back in the 1950s, about 3/4 of the homes in America only had one bathroom. You know, I live in West Ashley, and there's a lot of homes over there from the 1950s and 60s. In fact, one of my very good friends, who's a professor at college in Charleston, I go over to his house quite a bit. He's only got one bathroom in his whole house. It's this cute little house in that really fancy part of town everybody wants to live in there, Avondale. One bathroom in the whole house. It's a center bathroom in the house. You know, it's just incredible, but it's not just the number of bathrooms, how they've changed. I love this photo because this is the history of the bathroom all in one picture. And I'm sad to say I actually took a shower in this. When I was living up in West Virginia, College of Charleston had me down to give a talk, and I was happy to come back home. And they put you up in this like not temporary, but faculty housing, not guest housing at College of Charleston. So it's in one of those old buildings downtown. So check this out, it's an old clawfoot tub, and it was there before running water. And here's where they ran running water in through the floorboards so that the bathtub could have real running water instead of carrying it with a bucket. And then somebody decides to add a shower when showers become popular so that they do, you know, this thing on it. And it was really funny because I took a shower in that. And the floor of it is very rounded and there's no little sticky stuff there, you know. And I was in there, I was scared to death because I could just imagine myself slipping, falling, getting wrapped in the shower curtain. And you know what I would try to grab on the way down. You know that's not going to hold you up. I'm going to be down. But anyway, I got in and out pretty quick, but it's the history of the shower and a nice part of my presentation. This is what bathrooms look like today. You know, you get these beautiful glass showers and these jacuzzi tubs. You know, I love jacuzzi tubs. They're so much fun to get in when your muscles are aching or just to sit in and relax. And, you know what? I feel like everybody knows the story of Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, all these famous entrepreneurs. You know who I think is the most underappreciated entrepreneur of all time? Mr. Jacuzzi. I mean, we're virtually all going to get in one time in our life, even if it's on our honeymoon or whatever, have a room with a jacuzzi. I'd spend our wedding night in one and you don't even know the guy's story. Right? So anyway, the beauty of being a professor is this, is that when you want to know something, you can ask your students to find out for you. So I taught an entrepreneurship class and I assigned them to do a paper on pick an entrepreneur. And I begged the class, will somebody please, just please do Mr. Jacuzzi for me. Sure enough, my best student in the class picked Mr. Jacuzzi. So thank you, Michelle Paul. Anyway, courtesy of, the next story is courtesy of one of my very good students. So it's even a better story than Willis Carrier. Here you go. Mr. Jacuzzi, also an uneducated immigrant, he's a farmer. His son is born with a debilitating leg condition and takes baths every night. Mr. Jacuzzi, I don't know how he thinks of this, decides to bring in an irrigation pump from his fields that normally irrigates the crop and put it in the bathtub with his son. Now, can you imagine what his wife wants to say? He's carrying this thing through the house, probably got dirt on it. It's like, you're going to kill our son. Don't put that in the bathtub with him. And get that thing back out in the field. Anyway, it works. So Mr. Jacuzzi works on trying to turn this agricultural irrigation pump into something that's smaller and more portable that you could use in your bathtubs. And it works. And that's the history of Jacuzzi. And the Jacuzzi family owned the company, I think still to this day, at least it was last time I checked. And we now have these wonderful, beautiful Jacuzzis. Thank you, Mr. Jacuzzi. All right, so our cars and how they've changed. You know, they've got all sorts of things to prevent us from getting in wrecks and wonderful stereos. And they basically drive themselves and park themselves. Our phones and how they've changed through time. It really bothers me when students complain about how much these cost. I think it's because they don't know how much these cost. That costs about $5,000 and worked in 2 cities in America. It's crazy, right? Please don't complain about how much these cost. They're wonderful. Our entertainment, how it's changed. This is a typical TV from the 1960s. In fact, when I was a kid, I got the old hand-me-down TV from our dad. It looked just like that. I had a TV just like that in my room. And it got a whole 13 channels. Now, let me not mislead you, the dial went to 13. You had to pick them up with grab ears, so it was just how many local stations. So here in Charleston, we have 3. So as a kid, I had one of these with grab ears that picked up 3 whole stations in black and white with a line that goes around it. And here's what we got today. It's a virtual movie theater in our own home. And you can pause stuff, rewind it. You don't even have to be home when shows are coming on. You know, the speakers make it sound like movie theater sound or science. A calculator like this in the 1970s would cost a couple $100, and all it did was add, subtract, multiply, and divide. If you're a fan of any of those shows that show like the old, like Nick at Night that shows all the old shows, there's a really funny episode of The Brady Bunch where Mike Brady is in his office area. He's an architect back in the 70s, and his little son Bobby comes in there and starts playing with Mike's calculator, and Mike's like, Bobby, don't touch that, it costs $300. I mean, all this thing did was add, subtract, multiply, and divide, and add the memory button, nothing else. $300. Today, of course, you can get a calculator for $1 that does more than that stuff. Our computers, when I was cleaning out my college notebooks, I found a paper, and this was a Radio Shack ad in that paper. New for 1989, This is a Radio Shack computer, which is about the same level of brand today. Or it's not top of the line, not necessarily bottom, but definitely not top. But anyway, Radio Shack, handy 5,000 computer, 1989. $8,500, $84.99. Pay attention, monitor and mouse not included. The monitor would have been about another $600 or $700, if not more, if you wanted something nice. And that was only color one would have cost more than that. The color monitor would probably cost $2,000. Black and white one, which you could have got for a lot less. And then the mouse was another couple $100. And if you read the specifications, you'll laugh right on this. I mean, your phone has more memory than this thing has. Right? Anyway. Now, economists usually adjust for inflation. I don't even have to in this, but if I did, that's about $20,000 in today's money. And here's a MacBook Air today for $1,000 if you want it, and it's really incredible. I mean, how much better things are. And all these improvements are the result of individuals who contribute a little bit here and there to make this one little part better, and another one makes this little part better. In our video games, do a little fun topic. This was the best game ever invented. Let me tell you what. So I grew up here in Charleston. I was an only child, and my grandparents lived in Moberly, Missouri, which is 2.5 days, 3 days drive. I used to be stuck in the back seat of my parents' car with 2.5 days traveling across the country, and there was nothing to do in the back seat of that car. This was the first portable video game. It was football. So I used to be able to take it with me in the car and play it, and I was so happy. I thought, I'll never get this. So let me explain how great this is. You're the bright blip, and these are the defenders. They're the dim blips, and you can't run into them. So you have to wait for one to move up 2, and then you run around him, and if you go up this side, you get 10 yards, and you reappear here. You run around 10 times, and you get a touchdown. There's no passes, just running. So 10, and then it randomized what your opponent got, and then you got to go again. And we thought, man, it can't get better. Of course it did. Because the Atari 2600 came out for your TV. And after high school, we used to have Atari tournaments at my house playing football. And the beauty of it, there's 2 things that made this so incredible at the time. First is, they looked like men for a change. They weren't just little square blips. I mean, look how cool. These guys actually look like people. And there was 2 plays, running pass. And we think they just can't get better than this. This is the best thing ever invented. Until Madden football, of course. Now Madden football, it's got the reflections on their helmets. You can play live weather in the stadium. It's got the announcers. It's got the complete playbook of the team with their names on the jerseys. This is just how much video games have progressed. It's a story of going from Pong to Rock Band, Pong was the first video game. If you never heard of it, it's just tennis. And there was 2 settings, easy or hard. Hard just meant your racket went about half size. And you've got to understand, see, at the time, we thought this is the best thing since sliced bread. Look at the smile on his face, right? I mean, this is just so cool. We play video games in our home, And then, of course, there's Rock Band today that makes you feel like you're, a lead singer for a band or whatever when you're playing it. I mean, it's just really incredible how games have changed and technology. But more seriously, though, let's talk about our medicine. If you would have gone into a doctor's office in 1900, that's what a doctor would have had to work on. What was the main ingredient there? That is a bite strip for you to bite down why he uses the saw. Yes, medicine's expensive. We can now look inside your brain with magnetic imaging technology. I mean, there's thousands and millions of people who had a hand in the technologies that progressed us from there to there. You want cheap medicine, we know how to get that, by the way. We could go back to this. Office visit probably wouldn't be more than $3 for his time just to chop off your family, right? Anyway, but here's why this is so serious. This is unprecedented in human history. What's happened since 1900 because of these advances is that life expectancy for the average American citizen has gone up from 48 years when this was it. When this was our technology in 1900, the average American died at 48. Half people died before 48, half after. 48 was the average. Today, the average person lives to 76. And for your generation, the average life expectancy is even higher because that's just everybody averaged together. You guys are probably living in the 90s and 100s. Twice as long as your great-grandparents and their parents were able to live on average. I mean, we've almost doubled human life expectancy in a matter of 100 years here. Nothing like this has ever happened on the face of the planet before in terms of human life expectancy and the improvements. But it's all happened because people were free to experiment with crazy ideas that nobody else thought would ever work. Our music and how it's changed, or 8-track tapes, now the iPod. This is the percent of people in America who had stuff, going all the way back to 1900, and this was from that 96 study, so some of it's progressed since then. But you may be surprised at the history of some of these, about the penetration of things. And I want to talk a little bit about this pattern and what it means. But let's just take a couple that you might be interested in. Let's take the telephone. So the telephone is this red line right here, and this is the percent of people in America who have a telephone, 50% right here. So at what year did half of Americans finally have a phone? 1945. We can look at some other things like electricity, which is this green line. About half of Americans had electricity by 1925. And here, so you can go on and do a refrigerator for your kitchen. The refrigerator is this blue one right here. So about half of Americans have a refrigerator by the 1940s as well. Some of the things you may not realize are as new as they are, which is puzzling to us who just think they were newly invented, is stuff like the microwave. Now, I think you guys probably think the microwave's been around forever. No, that's not the case. Here's the microwave right here. Half of American households didn't have a microwave until 1985. So when Michael J. Fox was starring in Back to the Future, half of Americans did not have a microwave in their home. Of course, microwaves are very, very expensive. Most families couldn't afford a microwave. Anyway, so of course what's happened is that's, stuff. A lot of other things are of course computers and cell phones are here in as well, but even clothes dryers are pretty recent, from clothes dryers. Not a lot of people had those until the 70s. Anyway, but here's what I want to talk about. All these things show the same pattern. When new things are invented, they're usually very expensive. Only a few people can afford it. A coast-to-coast phone call back in the 20s would have cost the equivalent of something an average worker a year's worth of wages. Most people couldn't even afford a phone, let alone a phone call, especially a long-distance one. Even when I was a kid, back in the early 70s, I remember my dad used to debunk my mom when she called her parents in Missouri. Like, no, don't stay on too long, you got to get off. And then your long-distance bill would be a lot. When I was in college, the girlfriend I was dating was out of town, but we had to call each other, and we didn't want to stay on the phone because we were so broken. It was like $1 a minute or something crazy. It was pretty expensive. So we used to just call each other, let the phone ring, and then hang up before we picked up so that we know I'm thinking of you and I care about you, but I didn't have that charge, Well, you guys don't have to worry about any text. But anyway, where I want to go with this, though, is that things are expensive. When we invent new things, whether it's a cure for a new disease, a new technology, it's going to be expensive. And it's going to take a while for competition in the market to drive down prices and increase penetration to everybody. It's the way it works. But what we've noticed is that through time, the speed at which that happens speeds up. Today's innovations get to everybody much quicker than that process used to take a long time ago. It's really a process of creative destruction. Creative destruction is where we've got this churning of new industries coming up and old things go by the wayside. Entrepreneurship is apparently destructive. It's not just creative. When you invent the car, is everybody happy about that? Who's not happy about it? Horse and buggy industry, who lobbied Congress to try to get the car outlawed. You realize the car put 500,000 people in America out of work? Everybody who made horse and buggies, people who raised horses, the blacksmiths in every town who used to fit the rims around the wheels, the people who made all the leather harnesses, equipment, the whips for the buggies. These people all lost their jobs. They lost their family businesses. Their kids had to move to different cities, find something new to do. But we're all better off living in a world where we allow those transitions to happen. They're painful. The best policies allow those to happen and help people relocate rather than trying to slow down this process. Capitalism critically relies on the profit and loss system to direct this process. That is, what we do is we allow entrepreneurs to free to try all these crazy ideas they want to try, and then we subject them to a profit and loss system to give them quick feedback on whether their idea was good or bad. For example, in downtown Charleston a few years ago, a restaurant opened called Caviar and Bananas. Do those things go together? How do we know, though? As entrepreneurs, we're free to try putting all sorts of crazy things together. And what's the signal in the market that tells us whether we've stumbled on a good idea or a bad idea? Profit and loss system. That's its role in the economy. Right? You're free to try ideas that other people don't think will work. I mean, we'll talk about some in a minute, but even like shoes with little lights on them for kids. People laughed at those. There are a lot of people turned down investing in that idea at the beginning. Clearly they caught on, right? But it's the profit and loss system that provides the real feedback, not some guy sitting in an office looking at a business plan. Things that people like, they're willing to pay for, they shop there, their firm's profitable, it grows, it expands. And companies that do things that people don't want to buy or they don't like as much as the cost of production, they get losses and they go out of business. And the profit and loss system, including the loss part, is essential to capitalism. You've got to let businesses fail. Banks who make bad loans, stupid loans that they shouldn't make, should go out of business. BB&T refused to make any subprime loans. John Allison, their CEO, knew all the other banks were headed in the wrong direction with this. We're going to get hurt when something happened in the economy. BB&T intentionally set aside billions of dollars with an intent to buy up those other banks as they failed. John Allison told all of his investors, we're going to just wait for them to collapse, go in and buy them up and move them under better management. And when you hear John Allison speak about the recession and what happened, he's like, this is a travesty. You know what happened? I was right. We're the only bank who didn't do this. All the other banks did, and what happened to them? They start going bankrupt, they're losing money, and guess what the government comes in and does? Bail them out. Came in and bailed them out. See, the profit and loss system works this way. When companies go out of business, it's not like they disappear off the map. What you do is you have a bankruptcy auction of the assets. They're valuable assets. People buy those assets and redeploy them somewhere else. Those banks would now be under the management of a much better bank, BB&T, had we allowed the normal market system to work. Canada, for example, didn't intervene in its banking system at all. You know who said everything was too big to fail? The companies who wanted the bailouts. Scared people to death. Our whole financial system is going to collapse. No, your bank's going to collapse, but only temporarily because somebody's going to buy it up and take up all the people who were there. You need the law system, and too willing today are governments to go in and try to bail out people who deserve to have their assets go under the control of somebody who can run them better. The key part of this, though, is this process can't be centrally planned or directed. It must be discovered within the market. Nobody knows enough to centrally plan the economy, and this is a real mistake, because a lot of governments think that, oh, well, we know what the future of South Carolina is. Let's create tax credits for this industry because it's our future. Here's why it's not going to work. Even people in their own industries don't know the future of their own industries. At the beginning of the computer industry, Digital Equipment Corporation was one of the first entrants. They were doing like cash registers, calculators and stuff. And Ken Olsen was their the founder. He was basically the Bill Gates or Steve Jobs in the mid-70s. Popular Mechanics interviewed Ken about the future of his industry. Now, Ken sells computers. And you might have heard jokes about, these entrepreneurs, they'll try to sell ice to Eskimos, right? Imagine this, a guy who sells computers gets asked, Ken, tell me a little bit about the future of the computer industry. And he's quoted in Popular Mechanics as saying, there's no reason anyone would want a computer in their home. How could he have been so wrong? He made computers. Not even the people in the industry could have foreseen the future. How could he have been so wrong? Well, it's pretty obvious. You know what computers looked like in 1977? They were the size of this room, and all they did is crunch numbers. Do you want one of those in your home? No. And that's what Ken was thinking. Nobody would want one of these in their home. Ken could have never foreseen that that computer that was the size of this room and crunch numbers would turn into one of these little laptops where you can, meet your potential spouse, check the weather, learn how to build bombs, all sorts of crazy stuff with these things. And gosh knows the inappropriate stuff that's on there. You can read the news, It's so funny because my dad still doesn't use computers, and he's always trying to catch me up on the news. Like, he'll watch like Dad, I saw that on Yahoo this morning, It's like you're a day behind now on the news, Anyway. But here's one story that should inspire some of these students. Fred Smith, founder of FedEx, was an undergraduate student at Yale. He was a senior at Yale, walked into his capstone business course, and the professor said, for this semester's grade, you've got to write a business plan, business idea, and turn it in. So Fred Smith goes back to his dorm room and writes up the business plan for FedEx and turns it in. Now keep in mind, this professor is one of the nation's leading experts on business plan evaluation. He's the kind of guy that's taken up from his hire to come in and do cluster analysis for them so they know where to try to invest for the future of their state. Well, Fred Smith to this day still holds up that business plan in speeches and reads what his professor wrote on it and read it. Quote, the concept's interesting and well-formed, but in order to earn better than a C, the idea must be feasible. Can you imagine that being the first person to look at the business plan for FedEx? You're a Yale University business professor, the head of the, whatever, and you say, nah, sorry, it's a stupid idea at FedEx. Guess who proved him wrong? The profit and loss system proved him wrong, right? And that's the beauty of the profit and loss system, is these people can experiment, and it doesn't matter whether his professor believed in him or not, the market believed in him, and he was able to earn profit. It's funny because they've interviewed his professors. Professors like, hey, you just have to understand, at that time the post office couldn't even figure out how to do this at a loss, And they already had branches in every city in America, a transportation network. Here I get an undergraduate student who's never worked a day in his life. His parents aren't in the logistics industry, so he has no experience in logistics. The kid probably stayed up too late drinking last night. He's writing me up this paper on he's going to deliver packages across the country for people at the post office. He's like, what would you give it? C. You can't do that. You think your state economic development officer would invest in them? Any of those guys look familiar? Lower left, that's Bill Gates, of course. That's Microsoft's first company photo. You might have heard if you invested with Microsoft early on, you'd be rich today. It's true. But here's the funny part. They weren't out begging for investors. They didn't raise nearly as much money as they wanted. They had trouble getting people to give them money. And you can kind of understand why. Normally, if a group of people like this comes asking for your life savings and you give it to them, they go off and do drugs with it. But these people went off and changed the way we live. This is all coming to a really important point. You know what capitalism is about? Capitalism is about freedom. It's about freedom for crazy hippies, college students, uneducated immigrants to roll the dice, to try out an idea, even if other people don't believe in it. The ease to roll the dice and experiment. And the more rolls of the dice we get, the more Microsofts and Apples we stumble on. And we've got a system of profits and losses that give them quick feedback on whether they're on the right path or not. And we even correct them midstream. I moved back to town, I ran into one of my high school friends because I needed some work done on my house. And he was telling me the story of his business. He's like, yeah, I just been doing general home construction and repairs and blah, blah, blah. He says, it's funny, one person asked us if we could do their home for a handicap upgrade. You know, put in the ramps and make the doors wider. He said, I'd never done that before, so I got online, read a bunch of stuff about it, learned how to do it, talked to some friends. And so we did their home for handicap stuff. He said, the neighbors liked what we did so much, they asked us to come do their house. He says, lo and behold, now my business entirely, that's our specialty. We do nothing but go around and make houses handicap for people. He's like, that isn't even what I went in business for, but it turned out to be the most profitable part of what we were doing, but he found it through experimentation. And that's what the profit and loss system does, is it guides our behavior and decisions towards those things that we're best at and that create wealth for other people. Now, states are different in their reliance on capitalism as well. We have different economic policies. Here's the Economic Freedom of North America rating. We also does Canadian provinces. But as you look around, look at the poor states, West Virginia and Mississippi, they're red. Right? Now, unfortunately, South Carolina isn't doing too well in this index. We're in the 40s. We used to be in 9th when I was a kid. We've fallen a lot. And the result of it is we're pretty poor. Here's how we stack up against the other states. We're almost as poor as West Virginia and Kentucky. That's a shame. You know how wonderful Charleston is. We have ports, we have harbors, wonderful climate. We have all the resources to work with that you could ever want here. We're not land. I mean, it's just beautiful, and that's what we're turning it into. And again, the argument is that it's our policies, not our resources. We don't need more government spending more. We need to get some policy reforms that make it easier for people to become entrepreneurs. And I'll talk specifically about those in a minute. But here's what's really going on in South Carolina, just so you know this isn't all predetermined. If you go back to 1988, 20 years ago, here was South Carolina's average income. The average person in our state would make $25,000 a year. If you take the state, one above us and one below us in the rankings, Oklahoma and South Dakota. So basically, the average resident in these three states was equally rich 20 years ago. Fast forward to today. The average person in these two states is now about $5,000 richer than the average South Carolinian. That's just over 20 years. Had we had the policies of Oklahoma and South Dakota, we'd be $5,000 richer over that period. But we don't. We have worse policies. They're growing faster, their people are getting richer, and we're falling behind. It's a growth problem. Now, what can we do in South Carolina to try to get some more entrepreneurship going? First, make it easier to start a business by reducing artificial barriers to entry and competition. Now, the worst case is West Virginia. It's even worse than South Carolina. This is how many permits it takes to open a gas station in West Virginia. 13. Long gone are the days where a mom and pop can open a gas station, which is a shame because if you're older, you do remember the days when there was mom and pop gas stations and the owner used to actually come out and wash your windows for you and fill up your tank and talk to you about your day. Here's a Sam's Club in West Virginia, how many permits it needs. What, you don't know what you're getting when you're getting a Sam's Club? They're identical in every place in America. You got to subject them to this level of regulation. The problem with this is the following. In a world like this, it creates an advantage for the big companies who have tax departments and legal departments. And what it's shutting out is the ability of people like you, graduating from college, to roll the dice. Can you comply with all this? Do you even know where to start? Do you realize that this is a bigger thing than it seems like? They're going around America now and shutting down lemonade stands, bake sales, because they're not anywhere close to meeting FDA requirements. I mean, a kid selling lemonade in the street, do you realize how many FDA food rules that regulate is violating? It wasn't prepared in the kitchen, it was FDA certified, they don't have the right vent hoods, they don't whatever. I mean, what were the ingredients in it? Or there's no nutritional labels on them? I mean, these are real laws these people are violating. And all those laws that we passed, we did it with good intentions to make sure things are cleaner, safer, whatever. But what I'm trying to point out is that when you do those things, you're creating a secondary effect, which is you're making it harder and harder for people to roll the dice. I read a business plan in West Virginia, and one of the students who won was a hot sauce maker. He used to make it in his kitchen and sell it to all his buddies. He was making about $6,000 a year just selling hot sauce out of his kitchen in his apartment. He wins the business plan competition. We give the kid $20,000 to open his business. He comes back after a couple of weeks, he says, guess what? This isn't even enough to get me the nutritional label on the product. I called, he said, I know all my ingredients, but you know that label you've got, well, I don't know what that turns into. Nobody can tell you based on the ingredients what it is. You have to have the product tested. He said, they want $25,000 just for the testing and giving me information on the label. And he said, apparently I can no longer make this in my kitchen. He said, in fact, they tell me because I won this and now everybody knows about me, I got to quit making in my kitchen. So now I've got to quit making in my kitchen, I can't sell my product, and I've got to try to find a contract with a bottling company that passes all the FDA standards. The kid moved to Myrtle Beach for what it's worth, and he's not even in that business anymore. But that's the shame, because it didn't used to be that way. It used to be that you could experiment and do things, do bake sales, cook at home, and take it to a neighborhood thing and sell things. Anyway, to ease our regulatory burden, there's two things you can do. And I've done a lot of research on this, comparing regulatory climates across states, and which states have better regulatory environments than others. The states that have better regulatory environments have two things. First, they subject their regulations to cost-benefit analysis. That is, yes, that sounds like a great idea. We see the benefit of it, but wait, let's stop and figure out the cost. How many things are we eliminating? What are the secondary effects are we creating? So they require the regulations to be subject to cost-benefit analysis. And more importantly, though, they have sunset provisions. Let me explain how it works. When you pass a law, if you put a sunset provision in it, what it says is the law automatically expires unless they act to renew the law. So if you may remember a few years ago, there was one of the Bush tax cuts expired. Well, there was sunset. What happened is when they passed the tax reduction, it was scheduled to expire at a certain time in the future if they didn't renew it. Well, here's the problem with regulations. In the majority of states, once a regulation is on the books, it stays there forever until somebody fights to get it off the books, which is very hard. There's a very bad regulation up in West Virginia. They basically were scared cab drivers were driving their cabs for too many hours a day and getting too many wrecks. Cab drivers used to lease their cabs for 24 hours a day. So the state legislature passed a law that you can't have your cab leased for more than 9 hours a day. 8 hours you drive, half hour on either side to pick it up and return it. Stated intent was to reduce accidents involving cabs. Can you imagine what the real happens here? So we get the data from the DMV asking for all their accident data involving cabs. We plot the data, accidents involving cabs, we put a line in for their data as well as passed. Do you want to guess what happens to accidents involving cabs? How would you behave if you were a cab driver? You used to have 24 hours a day to drive your cab. You used to stop, eat with your family, go to your kids' soccer game, drive through the busy parts of the day. Now you've got, 9 hours to make your whole day's living. What do you do different? Speed faster, drive faster, take no breaks. Accidents involving cabs goes up by 20% the day after this law passes and stays up. And that's actually with fewer cabs on the road, because now there are no cabs on the road. So the cab drivers are complaining about it, that even the state police are complaining about this law. And it's still on the books. It was in my Unleashing Capitalism up there. I used to talk about it in speeches for 3 years in a row up there. And I'm like, here's a stupid law that we clearly is not doing what it's intended to do, a stupid regulation, get it off the books. And I talked to one of my legislative buddies and he's like, you don't understand. He said, you understand how the state legislature works. He said, we've got all these problems. We're in the middle of a recession. We have unfunded liabilities. We've got all these major things going on in the state. We don't have time to go back and look at some stupid taxi regulation. And that's the attitude in government. See, they pass all these regulations as part of some big thing and get them out of the way, and they don't have time to go back and get them off the books when they're not working. What sunset provisions do is flip that on its head. They require the regulation to sunset at some point in time unless it fights to stay on the books. That is, if you pass the taxi cab law, it automatically expires in 5 years unless somebody comes in and tries to renew it by proving that it's working based on data and effectiveness. States with sunset provisions have regulatory codes that are much more sensible than the ones who just keep passing stuff and it adds on and nothing ever gets taken off. Sunset provisions actually function kind of like a profit and loss system to weed out bad ones, unlike a system where everything that gets passed just stays there forever. The second thing we can do in South Carolina to make it easier for business to be more profitable and grow is to reduce the cost of doing business here. In particular, probably the biggest thing holding us up is our tax on capital investment. South Carolina has the highest tax rate in the nation, 10.5% on machinery and equipment. All right, so if you're a manufacturer, you come here, you've got machinery like this, a cellar bunker or a building or whatever, you're going to pay the highest tax in the nation. National Association of Manufacturers takes a representative manufacturing firm located in all 50 states and computes their tax burden. And this is in their book every year that manufacturers use when they're choosing across states. Well, here's the data. If you're a $25 million firm, which sounds like a lot to you guys, but isn't necessarily all that much for assets for a company. If you locate your $25 million firm in South Carolina, you're going to pay almost $2 million a year in property taxes. And that's not one time, that's every year. Every single year. You're going to have to generate almost about a 6 or 7% rate of return on your assets just to pay your property taxes here in the state of South Carolina. On the other hand, you locate that facility right across the border in Georgia, you pay about half. You locate it across the border in North Carolina, you're going to pay about a fourth as much. Go check out the data, and this is in Unleashing Capitalism, South Carolina, on what's happening with South Carolina port versus the Savannah port. When I was young, Savannah was a laughable port. Much, much smaller than Charleston. We had all this stuff. Savannah was nothing. Now Savannah is much bigger than us and growing. Why? Because all the stuff's located around the port. I wonder why all the big manufacturers and big, if you're Costco and you've got to build this big factory with all this equipment, where are you going to build it? At the Savannah port, where you're going to pay $760,000 a year on the building? Or here at the Charleston port, where you're going to pay $1.8 million on the building? It's putting us at a competitive disadvantage relative to our neighboring states. We have to do something to get this tax rate down if we want to attract capital here. And capital is important, not just because it's businesses, but capital is what makes labor productive. This guy who operates a feller buncher to harvest timber earns 5 times as much per hour as a guy with a chainsaw cutting down the same trees. And the irony is chainsaw operators have to pass 3 tests. To do a feller buncher, you only need to pass 1. It's actually an easier job because you don't have to worry about which way the tree falls. It hugs the tree as you're operating and protecting it with the cab. It takes more skill to operate a saw, and you earn 1/5 as much. Problem is those feller bunchers cost $1 million each. Capital is expensive. Capital makes labor productive. The more capital we have, the richer these people who drive it are because they're more productive and more. South Carolina could do a lot for itself by lowering the tax on capital investment, which is machinery and equipment. We even tax light fixtures here as part of our machinery equipment tax. Can you believe that? I was talking to this entrepreneur in Aiken. Walmart was coming to town. You know what happens, we'll talk about this more in a minute, is that the big businesses, of course, can negotiate and get tax credits. Walmart comes in, the city says, oh, we'll waive those taxes for you. She's like, it was going to be hard enough to compete with Walmart to begin with, but the city's waiving their taxes when I have to pay them. I'm even paying on the light fixtures. How fair is that? And that's what we need to talk about next, is that our government shouldn't be playing picking winners and losers. Crony capitalism is when business winners and losers are determined by political connections rather than private market forces. And see, this is a problem here in South Carolina. You know, if you're Boeing, you get a great business climate here. You walk into the governor's office, they waive all your taxes, give you millions in tax breaks. If you're BMW, you get that. You think if you're a small entrepreneur in Manning, you get that? You think if you're a small entrepreneur in North Charleston, you get that? No. And so what happens is it creates an environment where the politically favored firms are doing well and those that aren't can't really do much. And they're at a disadvantage. We have an economist named William Balbo who's become pretty famous talking about this. And what he says is that people can spend their time and talents in 1 or 2 ways. Either productive entrepreneurship, private sector creating wealth, or unproductive entrepreneurship, which is lobbying the government for favors. We end up with too many lobbyists and lawyers and too few scientists and engineers. And the problem is when you have bad policies, people spend their time and talents trying to lobby, rent seek, take money from others through the political process, rather than creating wealth in the private sector. When you have capitalism and good rules of the game, those people have not much to gain by going around and seeking out favors for politicians and instead get to work in the private sector. One of the biggest cases of this in South Carolina that we need to do is eliminate our targeted tax credits and subsidies in favor of broad-based tax cuts. Everybody. If it's good for Boeing, it's good for everybody, period. Any tax cut extended to one company should be extended to all companies. We should take the money we're devoting for incentives and split everybody's taxes down so every business in South Carolina can do better, not just the ones who lobby. Let me give you, I realize that I'm almost out of my time. I want to give one example of this because this idea I think is crucially important and I have a really good example because it's hard to understand this. West Virginia has 5 pages of exemptions from its state sales tax. One of which is for Girl Scout cookies. You know how that got there? Girl Scouts spent 3 days of their time in the state capitol with their Girl Scout uniforms on, lobbying the legislature, giving away free cookies. And sure enough, they get a sales tax exemption passed for them for Girl Scout cookies. But when I was living up there, the Boy Scouts came to my house and couldn't sell free stuff on a wreath, and guess what I had to do? I had to pay sales tax because the Boy Scouts don't have an exemption, only the Girl Scouts do. And so anyway, I was talking about how unfair this was at one of my talks up there, and afterwards the head of the West Virginia Boy Scouts was randomly in the audience. He comes up and he says, I know it's so unfair, right? He said, but don't worry, we're going to have Boy Scout days in the legislature next year. Now, let me tease 2 things out of that example for you to understand this. First, when people spend their time and talents lobbying, the Girl Scouts spend 3 days at the state capitol, we give up as an economy the things they would have been doing for those 3 days in the productive private sector. Instead of lobbying the government, what could the Girl Scouts have been doing for 3 days? I don't know, helping poor people, helping old ladies across the road, learning how to build campfires, working on school stuff, learning something. But instead they're becoming lobbyists for those 3 days. So when people take time and talents, put lobbyists in Washington, hire on, that's resources taken out of the productive private sector. We lose that forever. But more importantly, when you do it on a one-by-one basis, not only do the Girl Scouts have to send their people there, but so do the Boy Scouts, and then so do all the other groups. When you give out favors one by one, it encourages a ton of political activity, a ton of lobbying. And recently, with our stimulus, $800 billion that were given out to all these private companies all over America, office space in Washington, D.C., for the first time in American history, is now the most expensive place to have an office in the United States of America, surpassed New York City for the first time in American history. It's more important now to have an office in Washington, D.C., to have your interests represented there, than in the nation's business centers. That's crony capitalism. And that's a bad thing. We need to get this fixed. We need to have broad-based policies that apply to everyone. And the very last thing is we need to try to cut the size of government to allow entrepreneurs to have more money. Here's South Carolina. Government is a share of our economy. It's over 40%. Delaware is the number one index of government. Half as big as ours. And here's how they do it. Stuff like this, license plates that are half the size of all the other states, they're not in colors, they don't even have a period, it's just DEL. It doesn't say, welcome to wild, wonderful Delaware, pictures of the state. Drive across the border into Delaware, it's got a little mini sign that says Delaware. That doesn't even say welcome to Delaware. They don't have to, West Virginia has this 10-colored sign with a governor or whatever. They got to change it every time the governor gets reelected and change it at every border in the state. Delaware saves $50 million a year just on their license plates alone. And that's how they're able to give more money back to their citizens by not wasting money on little things. They save money, and South Carolina can learn a lesson from Delaware. We can also decentralize the local government. Anyway, thank you for your time. I'll be happy to stick around and get some Q&A if you guys like to. Thank you.